Hi, welcome to, I think, what is Module 7 in our diploma course. And this module is entitled Destinations. Before I start with my initial lecture, which is called Climate Friendly Travel Roadmap, I just want to explain that we'll have a slight change to the schedule. The specific lecture on the donut economics, we will hold over and we'll either put it on the Thinkific platform or we'll put it into another session. And the reason for that is basically just one of timing. If we have my initial lecture, and then we're going to have a really interesting presentation by Vincent Nice, who's the Deputy CEO of Flanders Tourism, and who is with us today. And he'll be here to be able to exchange with you after his presentation. And I won't talk about that now. I'll make some remarks before he speaks. But for the moment, I want to talk about climate-friendly travel tourism destinations. And I'm basing this lecture on a paper which you'll again be able to find in the Thinkific platform. And it's a paper which we will be running with quite a lot in the coming months at SunX Malta. And its subtitle is Plan B, a precautionary principle approach. And the paper has been developed not just for this lecture, but as a fundamental tourism response to the existential climate crisis. And I want to make that position at the outset. And again, this is a slide that we saw during our first set of lectures, which underscores that there's no other issue of the many issues facing our world collectively and nationally and even locally that's like the climate crisis, because the climate crisis affects all of these everywhere, and it threatens our very existence as a species. And what's more important, it does this in a time frame that affects all of our generations, my generation, your generation, and the following generations. And as the UN Secretary General has rightly said, it's a code red for humanity. Part of the problem is that there are conferences, there are speeches, there are policy papers, there are big events like the COP Climate Conference or the COP Biodiversity Conference. And for a moment, everybody focuses on the fact that this is a code red issue. And then when it's over, people go back to doing business, if not as usual, almost as usual. And this is particularly important for destinations because that's where most human activity takes place. Half the world's population or more lives in cities, major cities. All of those major cities are hub points for airports. So tourism to and from a country is probably going to go through these nodal points. And another important point I want you to think about at this start of this talk is tourism is a very important human activity. But it only takes place within the framework of a whole set of other human activities. And at a destination level, it's subsidiary to what I'll call the broader community lifestyle and the development needs of that community. So while the sector's views should have a strong consideration, the sector should have a key seat at the decision-making table. It's just part of a greater whole. And in thinking about tourism activities of destination, you have to think in terms of how do we fit in to the greater whole. I call it Plan B because for most destinations, Plan A, if it exists, are less robust than is necessary to meet the Paris 1.5 targets. Even people who have declared themselves under the Glasgow Declaration, and in the big picture, that's like 750 entities. Some of them are countries, some of them are groups of countries, some of them are organizations, so they're quite big, but others are individual. And in the total picture of the ecosystem, the people who have actually signed the declaration, a very small proportion. And also, that's the declaration. The implementation of a program, and you recall from our earlier lectures, with pathways and targets and commitments, is even smaller. And certainly, while many players in the tourism sector, many leaders, have picked up on the IPCC call for net zero greenhouse gas by 2050 and a 43% cut by 2030. And in many cases, they've done this recognizing that there's going to be regulation. For example, the EU regulation in this area is very well developed, and many of the important players and the noisiest players, I'll say that, they're part of the EU framework. So they're going to have to do it. It's not a question of whether they decide how they decide whether they want to do it. They're going to have to do it because it's going to be the law. But whilst many have committed to 2050 net zero and half emissions by 2030, few, if any, and I'm looking for any, have committed to the IPCC's calls for emissions to peak in 2025 if we're to have any chance of not only hitting the 2030 and 2050 emission reduction, but if we're to get close to the Paris 1.5 target by mid-century. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle calls for decision makers faced with uncertain risks to err on the side of caution and to take preventative measures. It's a very important element in environment policy making, much more so than in tourism. And Plan B is just that. It's a precautionary principle approach, a template for tourism destinations to factor the IPCC 2025 call for peaking emissions into their future development. And Plan B, and this is where we come to the roadmap. Plan B is based on a green growth model that I and some colleagues, particularly from Victoria University in Australia, led by Professor Terry de Lacy, we have developed a model over the past decade. It was actually launched in 2012 for the government of Indonesia. in a roadmap for a green growth future for Bali. And that you'll find in the Thinkific documentation. But since then, I've been updating it to include an increasing number of what I call clean and green initiatives under the UN 2030 and 2050 agenda for the future we want. And most specifically, the key elements of Paris 1.5, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Montreal Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF, as well as the assessments of the IPCC, and now the TPCC, the Tourism Panel on Climate Change, which, as I told you, I have been developing with the Sustainable Tourism Global Center in Saudi Arabia, and which we launched at the last COP, and which is now on its first year undertaking a stock take of all of the climate initiatives in the travel and tourism sector. And specifically also, we've included some thinking from Malta's 2030 tourism strategy, which actually has climate-friendly travel embedded in it. And it's not the only strategy. As I said earlier, we're going to hear from Vincent Nice today. And there are some really interesting elements of the Flanders strategy, which would be applicable to many, many destinations around the world. So here you see, Plan B consists of 7 distinct steps, each with a core focus on the overarching existential climate crisis and the transformation that we must all make starting now to avoid a cataclysmic future for our kids and grandkids. Step 1, community core. It starts with the reality of the specific community it applies to. So what is applicable here in one commune in Belgium, in Brussels, will not necessarily be equally applicable to another different community 5 kilometers away. Certainly different from anything in any of your countries around the world, the world's developing countries. And inside your countries, there will be different approaches if you're the capital city, if you're a smaller city, if you're a rural area. And all of these, as I mentioned in the last lecture, they may all start off in different places, but by 2050, they all have to be the same. They all have to be SDG 1.5, Paris 1.5 and SDG 13 and other relevant SDGs compliant. So the community is at the core. Then we have donut economics. Then we have our climate-friendly travel system. Then we have what I'll call cooperative visioning. And item 5 is the development of a climate plan. And the first 5 steps are developmental. And the last 2 items, item 6, measurable outcomes, and item 7, annual review and KPI, these are more of a review process and keeping things on track so that it's not just a one-time destination approach. It's a continuously evolving, improving, and checking as to whether you're actually achieving the targets that you set when you worked on this in the beginning. And I'm going to now go through each of these stages. And at the end of it, I hope you'll see that there's a degree of coherence in this approach. So to start with the community core, this is where we have to have a local vision. Tourism development programs which integrate unique resident and local visitor needs into a coherent framework and deliverable actions which fit into the global requirements of Paris and the SDG. And we help to organize, and hopefully you will help to organize after you've taken this course and you're back in your roles as strong climate champions. You will help to organize, working with the relevant governance, how to put the framework of a plan together, and to help each destination where you're involved to co-create the future they want. Co-create all the stakeholders, the governance who have the ultimate responsibility, the tourism sector, visitors, and most importantly, residents, because it's their community, and they will have to be the ones who make ultimate decisions as to how much tourism and what kind of tourism they want. And in all of this first level of development, we should never take our eye off the evolving global, regional, and national climate response imperatives. And that you see at the bottom. This is the red core, which you saw before in the targets. You see the various tourism activities displayed there. And you see at the bottom this Paris 1.5, SDGs, GBF, Global Biodiversity Framework, NDC, Nationally Determined Carbon Emission Contributions to the total emission reduction, and VNR, the Voluntary National Reviews of the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, 169 targets and 200 plus indicators. Every year, countries have committed to provide reports to the UN system on how they're doing. So these are things which have to be taken into consideration at the core. The second item, and this was where we were going to have a deeper dive, but we're not going to do it yet, is into donut economics, where we bring a British economist, Kate Raworth's relatively new, 10 years old approach to how you should measure the economic impact of activity within a community, and the kind of safe space that she calls it, the thriving space, that you're seeking to apply by your strategic policy and your regulatory and your market interactions within a community. And here, I think we had a little mention of it during one of the earlier lectures. It's called a donut because there's an outer edge, and that's the planetary boundaries. And there are 9 of these. And these weren't initially developed by Kate Raworth. They were developed at the Potsdam Climate Institute. And again, in our Thinkific material, you have some videos of the head of that institute talking about these outer limits of activity. They include things like climate. You can see on the graph, maybe you can't read it so well. Climate, ocean acidification, weather patterns, ice, polar ice capacity, a whole host of earth science targets which have been established that we should not pass. A good example, back 20 years ago, late 1990s, some of you may know they developed some theories on the growing hole in the ozone layer, which was caused at that time by chemicals, many of which were being used in refrigerators. And the impact of these chemicals was actually collectively building a hole in the ozone layer with an impact on climate change, but also an impact on radiation of humans. So in 1997, they created a convention where governments would put measures of controls on this, controls on individual refrigerator production, sprays, hairsprays, all these things which seem to be so micro, collectively having a macro effect on earth sciences. And that's exactly what we are considering here in the outer limits of donut economics. And then Kate Raworth drew an inner limit, and that's how you get the donut. The outer limit is the planetary boundaries. The inner limit is the social boundaries, gender equality, child education, how you deal with less disabled people, a whole series of activities, unemployment, what you can do to produce healthy communities. And this space in between the outer limits and the inner limits, this is the donut. And in our approach to Plan B, we believe that every community should be capable of applying a donut approach to its own situation. And in fact, Kate Raworth, after advancing this theory, then sought to have proof of concept cases, of which, first of all, she persuaded the city of Amsterdam to do an incredible analysis of its socio-economic realities and fit them into her donut. And then to do forecasting to see, are we going to stay within these limits? And if we're not, what should we do to make sure we do it? So it's a totally different approach to the traditional economics, which has said, well, we have the same issues, but they're driven by the growth requirement and by the market requirement and by some social programs, etc., but not in any sort of coherent approach. What Kate Raworth's donut does is gives it some coherence. And this now is being trialed in, I read recently, something like 145 cities around the world. So it's not fringe anymore. It's become mainstream. And obviously, the outer limit of the donut is the existential one, the planetary boundaries. And then, having started with the core, applied the donut, the next thing is to talk about climate-friendly travel in this framework. And this is picking up on the last lecture that we discussed and the debate topic that you worked with since then. And we think this is the critical tourism component. But of course, we would say that, wouldn't we? But here again, you can see, again in circular shape. So there's some coherence to this plan. It's like a target, as if you can think of it as a target with a series of concentric circular activities. And in this one, as you've seen, the first step, companies and destinations join the program through the free UN-linked climate-friendly travel registry. They access curated good practice data and a transparency eco badge, so they can say, hey, we've started this process. We've identified what the issues are. we've registered our commitment to be a part of the Paris 1.5 future. And all of this is done via the registry. You heard Hans talk about it in the last lecture. And the second item, they then get support for their climate and sustainability plans. Again, this is where you come in. You are going to be helping to organize at a national level the joining of people into the registry. This will be part of the program that you undertake during your second year of internship, where you will try to find travel and tourism companies and communities who publicly share this same what I call green and clean mindset. And you will work with us at Sunex Malta to encourage these people to join the registry. And you will act as a support system so that if a small hotel doesn't have a sustainability group, you might find a way to help them find what they need as to deal with their energy issues, to deal with their waste issues, to deal with their water issues. And this you'll be able to find on our hubs in the Sunex Malta program. You'll be able to find it from work that's being done by another set of students in Toronto to look for this stuff on the web. There's so much of it out there. And to put it into some sort of manageable process that if a small hotel in Chad says, I really don't know what I can do about renewable energy, you working with us will be able to help them. And this will be your second year, your internship. And there we also will have the SDG 17 partner organizations that we reference. And you can see this on the slide here, just to the left of the red arrow, climate-friendly travel support services, which Ollie spoke about during our last meeting. We have 40 or more serious businesses with whom we've signed agreements that they will make their services available specifically for the people who have joined the registry. And some of those services are free services, so it's a very good benefit that will come to the people who sign up to the registry, again, free of charge. And then the third item is the promotion of the people who've joined. It could be a certification program that they've been doing. It could be an in-house team which is doing something. It could be a service provided by an SDG 17 partner. All of this will be shown in their climate plan, which is put on the registry. And they will have an eco badge. You can see eco badge in the center of this diagram, which they'll get when they join the registry. I'm committed. I'm part of this community that believes in climate-friendly travel. And then up on the top, you'll see there is a second badge, a gold standard that says I'm not only committed, I filed a plan. And we will promote these over time, a long period of time, to consumers, so that just like, as I mentioned in my last lecture, when I go to the supermarket and I want to buy some eco food, I look for the bio sign. And here people will look for our sign. And we're in the process of creating a new climate-friendly travel club. You'll see this coming out in the coming months. And the climate-friendly travel club will be pitching to consumers, to travelers. And we're going to try to build a rewards club for travelers. So those travelers who actually say, we believe in this stuff, we want to travel in a way which is climate friendly, instead of putting their money into offsets, which is maybe good, maybe bad, but you burn your money, you spend it, you don't get it back. In our club, they'll invest their money. And after a couple of years, they'll be able to take it back in the form of climate-friendly travel holidays in those tourism entities which have signed on to the registry. And the club will promote this two-way program by getting special awards and special benefits, so that when climate-friendly travelers check into a climate-friendly travel hotel, they'll maybe get a free drink in the bar, a free meal, free use of the spa, a couple of nights free, all sorts of things which will come because they are traveling in a climate-friendly travel fashion. And we will use that funds to promote the increased development and availability of sustainable aviation fuel, particularly to the countries that you represent here. Because, as I've said before, you'll be the last ones in the line. The sustainable aviation fuel is going to go to the big hubs first, from the big airlines first, and eventually it'll get to the smaller, least developed countries. And that's where we're putting this focus with our Plan B. That's where we're putting our focus by bringing you into this diploma system, and by looking to you to help build this framework. Don't forget, 100,000 strong climate champions by 2030. That's our strategy. And the only way we can do this is by training groups like yours, having them continue the process at home, and then building much bigger groups under a WhatsApp or a chat, whatever form of chat that you use, to keep a growing community. And that takes me to item 4. Item 4 is the visioning by the stakeholders. This is perhaps the most critical area, because it involves co-creation of a phased community development framework. And it has to be, on the one hand, led by the governance, because the governance has the ultimate responsibility to shape the framework. But it has to have a very strong input from local residents and from the tourism sector, who are representing the interests of the visitors. And where it's needed, you, and working again with us, you'll help to organize stakeholder visioning clusters. And I've been involved in this in our work in Bali, particularly, but also in programs we started to do in the Caribbean and in the Indian Ocean. And this includes representatives of all stakeholders who together want to frame that future. Ideally, it should be done together with an academic institution, so that there can be an academic discipline and knowledge that comes to the process. And also it should provide a good framework for working with the media. Each place will be different. Everybody has different regulations concerning media engagement and propriety of information, particularly as you're developing policies. But the media ultimately have to have an important role in this. Item 5 is evolving the community plan. This is where the overall roadmap is put together by the governing authority. It'll take into account the visioning outcomes, which will establish programs, boundaries, donut-type boundaries, timescales, financing issues, including searching for new and additional financing. And this approach goes beyond traditional travel and tourism norms in that it seeks to fully engage all of those elements which you see at the bottom in red, which are the critical issues from a climate perspective. If you think back to my first remarks before I talked about these 5 steps, I said that it's so easy to forget the existential climate needs. And with so much going on, and with the world in such intense communications, which can only become more intense with time, it's absolutely imperative that these red arrows are kept front and center in the development of any plan. And another point I've made to you, which I want you to think about, this plan is going to be developed and driven by tourism authorities. But somewhere else in the government, there's a climate and an environment authority. And what they are doing is going to be critical to the development of the tourism plan. So it's not only within inside this group that you'll be dealing with of stakeholders, you're going to have to think about what other departments are involved in this. It's not just tourism people. It's the economy people, the Minister of Finance. It's the Minister of Trade. It's obviously the Minister of Environment, the Minister of Climate. In the UK, they even call it a Minister for Net Zero, because they were the people who delivered the net zero concept in Glasgow. So this is a complicated situation, and still we have 2 more pieces to go in this target. The first is you need to have measurable outcomes. Plan B has to give a clear development strategy, which will have issues at the core, which involve research, action, planning, and co-creation. And it will be for a wide range of issues around economy, product, brand, marketing, technology, investment, jobs. All of these items will have outcomes which can be identified, desirable outcomes, and targets to measure them. And the targets will have what we call KPI, key performance indicators. And there needs to be a formal review of these indicators every year, in my view. And of course, that formal review will be organized by the governance. It could be in the EU, for example. It might be the DG GROW, the people who are dealing with transport and dealing with tourism development. At a national level, it could be a tourism ministry. It could be a planning ministry who looks at this. It will cover national and regional greenhouse gas reduction, other climate-related issues, and SDG issues and biodiversity targets. It'll cover digital impact and traditional finance. It'll cover capacity management and the education system. How is the green education going through the school system and the universities? So this is the 7th item. Now, in putting this roadmap together, and Plan B as we now call it, we see this as a guidance template that can be used by any tourism community, and it can be used to test what kind of strategy it might want to put in place, even whilst it's got an existing strategy in place. So it can be a kind of modeling of the future. But, and this is the last and most important point, its starting point has to be emissions have to peak in 2025. So, for example, if in the community there are voices arguing we need more tourism to develop, the plan has to say how that tourism can be achieved without increasing emissions and over time actually reducing and eliminating those emissions over a 25, 30-year time frame. But this phase of it will be focused on the peaking in the next 3 years, because that's the real world that we're dealing with. We're not dealing with 2030 or 2050 now. We're dealing with now and next year and the year after. So if people want to have more tourism and they say we have to have more flights to our island, we're an island nation, we're dependent on this. The answer is, how can you make those more flights be less polluting? And the industry is saying sustainable aviation fuel is the only thing we can see in the 10-year time frame. Maybe some local regional stuff. You can't transfer your flights to trains if you're an island. And that will have to be a focus. Where do we get the means to increase the flights and decouple it from emission growth? Because our emissions have to peak. So that, in a nutshell, is road mapping, which we now call Tourism Destination Plan B, Climate Friendly Travel Destination Plan B. So I thank you for that. And now we're going to hear something much more focused and much more specific. My friend Vincent Nice, as I said, is the number 2 guy at Tourism Flanders, which basically, I don't want to go into the complications of Belgium, but Belgium has 2 main cultures. There's a Flemish culture, and which is related more to its linkage historically with the Dutch world and Netherlands. And there's a Wallonian component, which is linked to the French side of Belgium, because Belgium is in between Germany and the Netherlands and France and Luxembourg. And it's complicated, but it's found a way to live with its complications. And Tourism Flanders is in my view, the dominant regional tourism activity, which in all effect represents so often the Belgian position. And Vincent might talk about this. We've been friends for some years. We meet for an occasional lunch together. He's very engaging. He's a father of twin daughters, one of whom is 10 years old, I think, one of whom is the Belgian long distance running champion. He's a very devoted father, and he's a good guy. So with that, I'd like to welcome my friend Vincent. The floor is yours. Afterwards, we will engage with you guys with some questions and answers. Thank you.